We need to nationalize our building codes so that we can increase industrialized construction. Hey everyone, welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I am Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
And as usual, I want to mention that Built Rewards is bringing these smart conversations to you. If you have an idea for a guest or a show or have interest in sponsoring, email us at podcast@housinginsiders.com. And I will say, we've definitely gotten some interest. And so we've got some guests coming up. I appreciate those listeners who have taken the time to suggest and recommend some guests. I think we have some awesome ones coming up.
Thank you. It's your reviews and your sharing the word on our podcast that's actually helped us reach new guests, new topics, and obviously bring you new episodes in the future. So please keep it up. We really, really appreciate your support.
Yeah, we're looking to go viral and break the internet, so keep listening. I think we have a pretty exciting episode today, despite not having a guest. And I like when we get a chance to do this, just take a step back and talk about what's going on. I think we'll cover some headlines. We'll talk a little bit about what's happened recently with the nomination hearings of Bill Pulte and Jonathan McKernan. Worth noting, Jeremy, you mentioned this to me earlier, that it's probably worth noting that we are recording this on the day of the State of the Union. And so there's a lot that could happen in a few hours from now that might make everything we say completely irrelevant. So just worth noting that as we talk about the nomination. Jeremy and I also were recently at an economics conference hosted by HousingWire. So we'll cover off on some of our findings there. And lastly, we'll come back to some thoughts on housing supply and AI. So I think those topics will definitely be fun to talk about each one, and we'll try to keep it pretty quick just because that's a lot to cover in one episode. So anyway, let's start with headlines. Jeremy, I know you pulled a couple interesting ones as we've been watching the DOGE activities hit lots of the housing agencies. What are you seeing?
Well, I'll bring up one that caught my attention. It's a Wired article about who is staffing DOGE at these different agencies. And in particular, I think it caught our attention, John, because it was about HUD. And so anytime it's specifically DOGE and HUD, we want to take notice. This one was just the fact that there are a lot of entrepreneurs and private sector business types that are jumping in. And so it was, I didn't necessarily have a takeaway other than I think it was a little surprising when we originally heard either observations or criticisms of DOGE. We heard about 19-year-old software engineers running around different agencies. This paints a very different picture. This paints a picture of people who work in tech, in prop tech, specifically working inside of HUD. So that was notable to me. I don't know that I have some, sexy hot take on what that means for housing or what that means for HUD. But I think having access to the data was the headline that a lot of people threw out there, I thought to be more controversial and hot takey. What was interesting to me is these people know how to structure data. They know how to work in technology companies, particularly in prop tech. And so it caught my attention because I thought, I wonder what that will change, if anything, about how they view this project.
The conspiracy here is that you've got like DOGE able to access a bunch of data. And if I remember correctly, Elon Musk said like they're not going to get paid a lot. So like maybe the incentive to join DOGE is you get access to top secret information at places like HUD to help your business. I mean, I think that would be the sort of conspiracy that one might throw out. But on the other hand, it's like, oh no, we have real housing experts that work in the industry working at HUD, like what's going to happen? And I think maybe it's kind of a good sign that you've got some real experts, including, companies that we know that are in there. But of course, I mean, not to make light of it, it's certainly something that needs to be cautiously approached as people are getting access to really sensitive data.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you lost your job and somebody is essentially volunteering from the private sector to come in and either do your job or eliminate your job or do your job more effectively, like, that is controversial. And I understand there's a lot of emotions wrapped up in that. I think what struck me here was, I think there's probably two things. One, I just think it's proximity to power, proximity to Elon Musk. There's probably just some people feel like they want to be close to this like somewhat historic movement. And then two, I'm with you. I actually don't think the access to the data gets you very far or gets you very much. I think it is the belief, and this is where people on both sides, right or wrong, the belief that technologists are going to do better rebuilding databases and rebuilding technology infrastructure cheaper, faster, stronger. Whether that's true or not, they're going to cut down all this stuff and then purportedly make it better. And I think that's actually where the most controversial opinions have come in, is like, do you believe that thesis or not? So that's kind of what I think that was interesting about that for me.
Yeah, it sounds more constructive. I mean, certainly it's hard to deny the fact that the government's oftentimes behind on technology. I mean, we're reading stories about paperwork being filed 200 miles underneath the earth in some cave, right? So all these kind of random stories. But I think the thing a lot of people are reacting to in housing is just the sort of shut everything down and then rebuild it as you see things that are necessary. And this is a little counter to that narrative. Like, you got people coming in who are thoughtful and who are approaching it the right way. But on the flip side, I mean, we've seen there was a story of, I think just today or yesterday, Maxine Waters, went down to HUD with protesters to hand Scott Turner a letter signed by 122 congressmen, saying that what they're doing is wrong and they're, really endangering important affordable housing programs. So it's hard for me to say like what all that means. Just one random reflection is that if these programs are so important, when they get shut down, we should see the ramifications of that. And so in some ways, you got to be hoping that bad things happen, which is a weird thing to hope for, but you want to sort of say, look, bad things are happening. We need these programs to exist. Because on the flip side, if nothing bad happens, it sort of proves the point that nothing good was happening and it should have been shut down. But this process is an odd one to watch for sure.
Well, it's so complex. I think that's why it took so long to get here to where we are addressing it in the way that we are. And I'll say it this way. There's been a long-standing strategy in tech called kink the hose, where you just you don't turn the hose off, you don't put the hose, you stick it, see if anything happens. And if it does, just immediately let that data flow or let that program flow. To me, that is a known tech strategy. The difference here is, it's one thing with data, it's another thing with social programs for the elderly or social programs with vulnerable populations. It's like, I understand and I feel that here, but do you get a sense that what has happened so far, we don't have projected in the future, do you get a sense that what has happened so far is a direct threat to affordable housing?
That's a great question, and I think we're just gonna have to wait and see. I hadn't heard that phrase, kink the hose" or whatever. I mean, that's kind of a really interesting way, and I'm fascinated by the whole thing, and I've always been fascinated by the question of like, how do you upend a bureaucracy that stops being effective, and is this the strategy that's going to actually make the change? But anyway, lots to come. I mean, I live in Washington D.C., and it's a particularly sensitive issue for me, as I have friends and neighbors and other people who are finding themselves suddenly out of a job because the hose has been kinked. And it's, to your point, it's a real emotional thing. But let's pivot from that topic. I wanted to mention what I thought was a really interesting Washington Post op-ed from somebody who happened to go to college with me, a friend of mine, Tim Carney, who usually writes for the Examiner. The headline of his op-ed is, "Forget return to office, Mr. President. That's no way to fix a baby bust." His argument is basically, as the title would imply, that this forced return to work is going to create more problems for people that are trying to start families, and that this is running counter to a lot of things that we've heard J.D. Vance and others in the Republican Party talk about, sort of the importance of having more babies because we're going through an insane baby bust. I will mention a couple of interesting things from the article. There's a couple of anecdotes about like things that people have found out as people have been quote unquote working from home in the government. So I guess somebody in the Social Security Administration was working from home, but was also running his own private home inspection business. So there are these kind of funny stories where people clearly weren't really working from home. They were just collecting a paycheck. But I mean, a little better policing of that and maybe working from home is actually a good solution. I don't know, Jeremy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a fascinating take on it, that family formation, household formation, or other kind of things that are fundamental to households are actually the key that government should be focused on, or that policy should focus on. I think what you said is fascinating because every policy is going to have outliers. Whether the outlier becomes story and the outlier becomes the headline is, I think, the critical question to whether the policy survives or not. And so this one Social Security Administration doing a side business, it's like that could be the one out of a million, but that could become the headline that comes to embody working from home. I think the thing I thought about the most with things like meritocracy or the other themes that came out of this administration, which they pit against government work or they pit against work from home, that I didn't understand, is how does the meritocracy work when you are limited in your talent pool to only people who commute to your office? So like the idea is this like, well, we're going to run a meritocracy, but only if you live within 30 miles of DC or only if you live within 60 miles of New York City. It's like, okay, is that a meritocracy? Or are we actually just saying it's the best person for the job, assuming this, and this are true? So I think that's kind of where I am curious from what I call the political side about which wins out versus what is the policy ramifications looking at household formation.
I think your point is the one that I've often pointed to, which is remote working will eventually be the way we do things because there are economic drivers that make it the case. And so the argument has often been made that when people are together and in person, they are more effective and more productive. That argument has been debunked time and time again. Again, these sort of one-off anecdotes of why people aren't working or aren't working effectively remotely are really just that. They're outliers. And so the thing that is truly economic is that you pull from a bigger working pool, you have less commute times, you have a happier workforce because, as you know, my friend Tim says in this article, that when you're able to work from home and you're married and you have kids, it just makes life a lot easier because you're not worried about commuting and figuring out how to get to the office and pick up your kids when they're sick. You can just manage that and then use, the time you'd otherwise be spending commuting to actually get more work done. So I do think the economic drivers are going to overwhelm this sort of everybody get back to the office kind of nonsense that we're going through right now. But that's just one man's take. Okay, so ironically, Jeremy is calling in from an office where he's got bad internet. I'm actually working from home where my internet is doing quite well. But we'll hope that Jeremy is going to sound a little better going forward. We'll pivot now to the next topic. Jeremy, did you have a chance to follow the hearing and watch Bill Pulte and Jonathan McKernan?
I tuned in right at 10 a.m. Eastern time for the kickoff, and I would say probably made it through the initial 6 or 7 senators. I was told by our friend Jeb Mason to keep an eye out for Elizabeth Warren's time, where she was allocated for her questions. I did not get to see Senator Warren, but I think the lead up, that I heard was quite moderate and reasonable around what the CFPB and the FHFA should be looking to do, what they mean to the housing market, and whether it was the Democratic senators asking about, would you make commitments not to risk this, or this in housing? And we can talk about what some of those things were. But by and large, they were the regulations Congress had passed and the fact that these entities legally exist under congressional action. It was things like that that they were looking for commitments on. And I thought the two nominees, I should say, excuse me, I thought the two nominees had a pretty straightforward approach on, hey, we're here to execute what is the mandate. And if it's explicit, we'll make sure that it's explicitly followed. And if it's not, then we'll evaluate that when we get in the role and see if it's something Congress told us to do or not in the initial third of the process. What did you hear, John?
Yeah, no, I heard the same thing, and I'll say the setup of the hearing was very strange because you had 4 nominees, 2 of which were very, extremely important economic nominees. And Elizabeth Warren made the case as she started to speak, like, I've got 75 seconds to anyway, she's making the point that this is a really tricky hearing for her because she just doesn't have an opportunity to lay into them as much as she would like to for 4 hours, right? Now, of course, she'll send them questions. They'll need to send her answers. She can vote not to nominate, right? Not to confirm them. But, but at the end of the day, it was a pretty brief tirade that she kind of threw mostly at Jonathan. I thought he did a masterful job, to your point. I mean, it's pretty hard to kind of continually be berated for, the CFPB is shut down. Do you agree? Do you support that? And she's clearly trying to put a wedge between him and the administration. But I think he did the only thing he could do, which is like, look, I'm not in the role yet. I don't know, I plan to follow the law. And in fact, we just saw news today, I think earlier today, that the CFPB is now functioning for necessary. I forgot how they phrased it, but like the original email, like don't go to the office, has now been changed to, if you're working on something that absolutely needs to get done, please come to the office type of thing. So anyway, we're seeing that lighten up. I think Jonathan will do a great job in that role. He's got his hands full. I was actually way more excited to hear Bill Pulte. He had just a lot less time to sort of talk. It sort of took the same, tact as you said, like, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to figure out what's going on. I'll make just a couple quick hits of things that senators mentioned that I think are just interesting in the sense that they came up. Manufactured housing came up a few times. And I certainly think that Leslie and her team over at MHI did their job of sort of prompting a few good questions in there. And Bill certainly committed to looking at the financing of manufactured homes and things like that, which is great. As you know, I'm a big fan of that. Appraisal methodology came up a couple times. I think Senator Warnock talked a lot about sort of the work that the PAVE group has done around appraisal bias. Certainly no commitment from anyone on what was going to happen there, but cost of insurance came up, and I'll throw out a random headline too I saw this morning, but apparently the prices on the land in the areas that were impacted by fire in California are skyrocketing as people like sort of swoop in and are really interested in bidding on those, burned out pieces of land, which is kind of surprised. But anyway, cost of insurance, I think Bill did a nice job of saying, I don't know exactly how FHFA can do anything with that, but, we're happy to take a look at it. There were a couple of points where the Housing Trust Fund came up, which is a sort of regulatory requirement for the GSEs to fund, and then 20% FLUB set aside. And, on the regulatory required one, we're going to do what's required of us. And on that one, I'm going to have to take a look at it. I'm not making any commitment on. So again, those were sort of interesting things. The last thing I'll mention is like surprisingly little about the exit from conservatorship, which is probably the thing that most people were interested in. I think it was Mark Warner who said, hey, if, you guys exit the GSEs and there's an explicit guarantee, the government needs to be compensated. But I think by and large, like the sentiment is we're not going to rush this thing. We need to be really careful because it's pretty central to the housing industry, and no commitment as to when or how or when what we're going to do around exit from conservatorship, which I personally think is the right answer. So I was happy to see that was kind of where it came out.
Those are the hot topics, right? Supply. We know that the value of homes, so appraisal as a component of value is huge. So I was interested to see that those two things, construction or specifically factory built manufactured construction and appraisals, took as much of the time as they did, given that it was only 75 seconds per question per senator or whatever you said. So that was a little bit surprising. I thought that the exit from conservatorship was a bit strategic. And what I mean by that is, hey, we're going to follow the law, is what you heard me say 30 minutes ago. So I don't necessarily have to piece it together 30 minutes later on to a different senator. But to me, it was, these things are supposed to be out of conservatorship because of the law. So expect us to follow that. So I don't know if it was as carefully and reasoned ultimately in the strategy or just in the way the strategy is discussed at the time of nominations. But I hear you that it was not the biggest thing talked about. And so that was also something to watch as they take their seat.
Yeah, I do hope it comes up. I mean, I personally am eager to talk a lot about GSE reform, obviously having spent so much time at Fannie Mae, and I think it's a really interesting debate. And in the meantime, I continue to say in every forum I can that the GSEs have a special and unique opportunity to do construction financing and provide subsidies there. And there are multiple ways that they can do it. And I would really encourage them to take a close look at those opportunities and maybe think about exiting from conservatorship as a later priority, as they continue to build capital and focus on the true crisis in front of us. So let's pivot to our trip to Dallas. It was great that we got to hang out for a day out there in Dallas and at the HousingWire economics conference. I will say, like, I was really impressed with how well produced the conference was. HousingWire does a heck of a job. The Bush Library out there, the SMU campus, just a gorgeous location. The barbecue served at lunch was fantastic. And so anyway, kudos to HousingWire for putting together a really awesome, at least very well put on event. Jeremy, any sort of key storylines from what we heard throughout the day?
Well, everyone who knew we were attending who wasn't able to attend, I think, asked me the same question, which is, what they say about rates? What was the headline on rates? That always is an economic summit, and housing is going to be about rates. So I think it's probably worth noting that the general consensus among almost all the economists who presented was, we're going to be flat or a slight decrease, but in the sixes. And it may go up slightly as well, but probably within the sixes as well. So like right in this margin of error that we're in right now is kind of what everybody predicted, because there'll be pressure. It won't be because nothing's happening. It'll be because there's actually pressure from both sides. There's a demand side pressure that is actually keeping rates and home prices, mind you, somewhat high because those who can afford a home can really afford a home. And so as a result, that demand kind of keeps it strong. But on the other side, there are efforts to try to get rates down to initiate some economic activity. And so those will kind of keep things in that same kind of range, was, I would argue, the rates headline.
Obviously, rates and home prices were kind of the two topics that were most discussed. And just to add to what you said on the rates, like my sense in a lot of the discussions was right now there are so many different variables that could potentially impact rates in this coming year. I think most people just don't really know what's going to happen, and I think we're just at a level of high uncertainty. What made it difficult to listen to is just like everyone was kind of looking at the rate issue from one particular perspective. Okay, we got tariffs coming that could create inflation. What happens if there's a recession? Trump, is he really going to be successful in getting the 10-year down? What about the spread between MBS and Treasury? Like there was just so like as you look at it from each different angle, you get a different answer, but it didn't really create a very fulfilling, cohesive story. I think the Sasquatch was and that's a little side joke because Silk Title had a Sasquatch come up and say that rates will be in the low fives by the end of the year, which is extremely optimistic. But in any case, it just was a very unfulfilling kind of discussion about rates. The home price thing, I think, was kind of the same. It just lots of things impacting home prices. People were sort of feeling like, hey, things are looking good. There are demographic trends, supply trends that are keeping homes sort of stable, but inventory is coming up a little bit, which is good. There are a couple little like Tampa Bay's looking a little bit weak, given the amount of inventory that's sort of flooding the market there. That could be related to insurance costs or other sort of trends. But on the home price front, again, I just sort of felt like there wasn't really a compelling story. And I think probably the most concerning thing for me was one of the presenters sort of assessed that we're growing at about 1.7 to 1.9 million households per year, and homes are being built at 1.3, 1.4. If those numbers are right, not only are we not addressing the supply shortage we have, but we're just continuing to add to the supply shortage, which is, to me, it's like that's the story, right? Not enough homes. I don't care if inventory peaks up a little bit. We don't have enough homes. And anytime rates are going to drop a little, demand is going to far overwhelm what homes are available, and it's just going to put prices up, and it's going to be a moot point. So anyway, that was kind of my takeaway on home prices.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I thought that everybody was being pretty soft on home price growth. They had home price growth being 3-ish%, 3 to 5% nationwide. But the reason I thought that was a little conservative was because the overwhelming data presented was, I think Ryan from Zellman and Associates, he called demand a coiled spring. One of the speakers talked about demographics is the destiny of home prices. And your point about Tampa is a really well made point, which is when there's a tiny dip, the national story is there's a dip, but it's so temporary and so quickly filled by demand of all types that actually it just ends up it keeps tracking up. It's just kind of step by step instead of a direct line up. But the bottom line is it keeps going up. And I think that's where we'll see home prices until some other innovation in construction or some other mechanism functions to change that. It'll just be up and to the right.
That's right. And for the audience, it kind of sucked. Like everyone's looking for potential more volume coming down the road. At low sixes, maybe you start seeing some refinance activity, some cash outs, maybe to do debt consolidation was something that I heard from several folks. But I just don't. I'm not optimistic about more volumes after hearing all the presentations. So
John, I'll end on this because you just brought it up, and I do think it is a good point. One of the things that stuck out to me from the data was just the massive amount of home equity available. So 56 million homes are owned free and clear. That represents about $20 trillion of equity. That is an enormous asset for the American homeowner. That also means, though, that 17 or 18 trillion is also owned. It's just owned with also an outstanding mortgage of some balance. And the one factor that I've been talking about a lot since the summit, or the one data point, was that if you took all of the houses in America as a portfolio, I think the comment from stage was the LTV is the lowest LTV in history for the amount of value in the market to what is under mortgage. and it's about 46%, 45%, something like that loan to value. That's incredible. And so there is going to be something that has to change over the next few years, because when you have an asset, you want to use it. And if it's a frozen asset, an underutilized asset, we know people, both markets and people, find ways to activate assets. And it's just too big of an asset not to be activated. So we will see something happen
So
around that.
totally. And maybe the HELOC market or something else gets really hot if rates go down. And it is it's a great point, Jeremy. That's all this money that's out there somewhere, just locked up. Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. And when we get back, I want to talk a little bit about some supply stuff. This episode is brought to you by Built Rewards. Built is a rewards program, just like an airline program that is centered around your home and neighborhood. But instead of earning miles for flying, Built rewards you for paying rent no matter how you pay. As a member, you can earn points at over 20,000 local restaurants, local merchants, and those points are now the most valuable rewards currency. You can use it to book travel, on Amazon, or even towards a down payment.
Built is revolutionizing housing. If you want to learn more, email John at lawless@builtrewards.com.
All right, welcome back, Housing Insiders. John and I are talking about some of the hot topics in DC, some of our takeaways from a recent economic summit with HousingWire in Dallas. And John, one of the things you mentioned at the outset, it came up a lot in the nomination hearings for Pulte and McKernan, and you had done some digging around the supply side. When we think about what we're up against here, you mentioned it a minute ago with the numbers around how many households are forming versus how many homes we're creating. Tell us a little bit about what you've been looking into and what are some of the recommendations on the supply side this year.
We've had a lot of conversations on these, and I'm sort of really coming to three sort of major recommendations that I'll tell anybody that'll listen to me. Number one is that we need to nationalize our building codes so that we can increase industrialized construction. That's a complicated one. I'll talk a little bit more. That's the one I've been really digging into. I think this idea of expanding opportunity zones, creating new land to build on, maybe reusing the Midwest, as we've talked about many times on this show, is the second thing that we really should focus on. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, like getting the GSEs to subsidize construction financing can be a way to get all of those things activated. So those have been my three big topics on housing supply. But the one I've been thinking a lot about lately is this idea of nationalizing building codes. And I do hope at some point we'll have a guest on to talk about this in more detail. But let's just suffice it to say that the way that we do building codes in America is so behind the way it's done in the rest of the world. And that's because of two things. Number one is we've left it up to local municipalities to figure out how things should be built. And number two is we have what's known as a prescriptive building code versus what's more common, which is a performance-based building code. And what that means is we will say that to build a wall, you need to use 2x4s. They need to be spaced by 6 inches. You need to use this type of drywall. So very specific and prescriptive about what you need to do to build. Whereas the rest of the world basically says you need a wall that will be able to withstand this amount of pressure and hold this amount of weight, so on and so forth. So that clearly gives builders a lot more flexibility to build in different ways and be innovative about building rather than the code that we have today. And Jeremy, I'm sure you've heard this before. You must be following this issue as well.
Yeah, I think the progress was made incrementally to try to think differently about especially all the different ways in which housing innovation is coming to market. How's that going to affect codes? And also looking at how recently codes were reviewed, because in some places, especially ones with massive development, I think they were reviewed more often. In other places, less often. And so you also have this uneven playing field, even across jurisdictions that are nearby each other, state lines or otherwise, where it can be very difficult with a factory just down the street across the state line to ship that home into your state. And so between factory built, the national building code is the way you defined it, or these types of reviews that at least will accelerate some types versus others, site built or otherwise, I think it definitely requires some attention. If you were going to address it, what are some of the ways you've been finding that can accelerate it, can standardize it? I mean, have you figured out a way to actually kind of...
Yeah, and this I mentioned to you, I feel like I sort of had a breakthrough here because The issue I was having I mean, there's so much precedent for having a nationalized building code that's designed in a different way. And it is so clear to me that it would open up industrialized construction. But the thing that you have to do is figure out, what is that national building code going to look like? How do we take all of these different building codes across the country, all of these different ICC codes? I mean, the number of acronyms that sort of determine the HVAC systems and electrical systems, so on and so forth. How do you deal with climate difference? Because you need different building codes if you're building in a cold, climate versus a hot climate, a rainy one versus a dry one, right? So there are legitimate differences. And like, I was looking at this problem thinking like, God, who could ever solve this? And then it hit me, because I've become absolutely obsessed, like I know many of our listeners, with AI. And I thought, well, why don't I give AI a chance to solve this problem? And I was actually using Grok this time, but using it to do a thought experiment. I said, what if I were building a factory in Pennsylvania and I wanted to ship to a 200-mile radius? Tell me how many different building codes I'd have to meet today, and what are some of the major differences? And I mean, of course, within like a millisecond, it comes back, it analyzes all of the places you'd be shipping to, all of the major differences in the building codes and those different things that you'd have to build for. And I sort of was taking note of it and realizing that a lot of the differences it was mentioning were weather related, right? So if you were sending something to New Jersey from Pennsylvania, you're on the coast, you got to deal with different wind, you have to deal with different, different temperatures, so on and so forth. And so I asked Grok, I said, do you think these differences based on climate are justified based on actual weather data? And again, in a millisecond, it came back and said, some of the differences, but most of the differences, and it gave me a litany of examples, are not justifiable. So, I mean, all of that, first of all, I mean, by now these stories must be kind of commonplace for most people that are following AI. But it dawned on me that if anything could go through a complex set of national building codes and figure out a national code that minimized the disruption of making a change, that thoughtfully dealt with things like environmental difference and climate difference, so on and so forth, and created a standard we could all get around, like AI could build that for us, and it could do it. Like I could probably do it tonight and have a proposal for people to react to. And that to me is really awesome. And I don't think a lot of architects or policymakers, like HUD, when they build the manufactured housing code, I don't think we're thinking like, boy, we should use AI to do a better HUD code. But now that AI has reached the point where it's
Yeah, the
reached,
manufactured code was the one I was thinking of when I mentioned incremental progress. But I think you're right, which is we often look for the type of use case. This is, I think, the type of use case AI should be really good at. It's a massive amount of complex data, but it's a closed universe. There are a limited number of jurisdictions. There are a limited number of building codes within those jurisdictions. You could say that weather's a wild card here and there, but to your point, we've overcomplicated it by making it too specific instead of saying, what's really important about the weather? Well, extreme weather, not all weather, just extreme weather. That's really what we're talking about. And by the way, you can project, I think, efficiency and savings also when you do build things this way. Rebuilding things this way is and maintaining them is also cheaper and easier. So as you think about the benefits from a policy perspective that you can claim by having this work, and then lastly, I just think it makes a lot of sense to have a machine do as much of the administrative toil as possible so that the human experts only have to do that last little bit, getting the ball across the finish line or getting the goal line, finish line, goal line. I'm like mixing.
one of the two. Well, I mean, what also blows my mind, and I've started increasingly using AI to problem solve. Like, hey, I'm dealing with this business issue, and a couple of the AI tools have this new like critical reasoning thing where it'll talk to itself for 20 minutes and then come back with a thought through answer. And one of the challenge, again, like there's a challenge of writing the code, but then there's the challenge of balancing all of the different interests, the politics of it, right? And so, we sort of think like, well, we'll have it do all the administrative stuff, and then we'll have to come back and then like debate amongst ourselves. Well, actually, no, we just, everybody that has an interest in this should say what their interest is, and then let AI figure out how to best balance all those interests. And you could argue that AI maybe is not smart enough, but frankly, it's smarter than most of us now. And so it really can both do the administrative and the politics of it.
Yeah, that's the way I was thinking about it, John, was like, I don't have to worry about whether it's as smart or smarter than us because it gets us so much past the initial stages of the meeting. Like, think about all the meetings we've been in where it takes 80% of the meeting to get to the point where you actually have the substantive work and discussion happen. And what I'm imagining you're saying is that let's have AI do that 80% to get all the interests up to the point of substantive decision making. And then we're actually utilizing our time way more effectively because we didn't have to do the consensus building and all the things you have to do to get to the table. It just puts us at the table like, let's go. And so that's what was exciting to me hearing you, talk about this potential opportunity.
Yeah, and look, the political will with the current HUD administration, with Pulte at FHFA, with Trump the builder who's talking about opening up federal lands, like getting a national building code is something we've debated as a country since we initially proposed it in the 60s and 70s. And there's a real opportunity in the next few years to do this. And the amount of housing innovation that we would see as a result of it, of sort of new prefabricated methodologies, volumetric, all of these different 3D, whatever it is, I think we could see a real explosion in creative home building that could finally address this supply shortage. I mean, that to me is what, like, this should ladder up to that really exciting moment for America.
Well, that's as optimistic as I've heard of you. So let's hope that someone is listening, and you, as the listener, you should share this episode with someone who can help us get a seat at the table. Because if anything, everything you heard from us on the policy and the economics leading up to this actually goes away. A lot of the challenges go away when you have the right balance. We say on this podcast a lot, everyone well housed. When you find that balance, that availability of housing across a spectrum of needs, I'll tell you what, it solves a lot of the consternation and inequity that we seem to try to solve in other ways and in other more expensive policy decisions. So
I cannot think of a better note to end the episode on. That was a great discussion, Jeremy. Always good to talk to you. That does it for this episode. As we said before, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. If you like what you hear, if you like this episode, leave us comments, leave us a review.
Thank you for listening.